I chose holding Robert's hand for 7 more days instead of keeping a roof over our heads. An 80-year-old widow slowly walked into Judge Judy's courtroom, carrying a worn leather purse and leaning heavily on a wooden cane. Her floral dress was neatly pressed, but her swollen eyes revealed hours of crying. At first glance, it looked like another ordinary unpaid rent case. But within minutes, the courtroom would witness something so heartbreaking that Judge Judy herself would leave the bench in silence for the first time in nearly 3 decades on television. The defendant was Margaret Sullivan. The plaintiff was David Morrison, a 62-year-old landlord from Brooklyn, seeking $2.541 in overdue rent and possession of the apartment Margaret had lived in for over 43 years. But this wasn't a normal landlord dispute. David had been Margaret's husband's closest friend for more than half a century. They had served together in Vietnam, survived war side by side, and remained inseparable ever since. For 43 years, Margaret and her husband Robert had paid rent faithfully every month. Then suddenly, 3 months ago, the payments stopped. Margaret stopped answering the door, ignored David's calls, and withdrew completely. David was left confused, hurt, and financially strained himself. Eventually, despite his loyalty and affection for the family, he filed the lawsuit. What nobody knew was the reason Margaret stopped paying rent. And when she finally revealed the truth, the entire courtroom broke down. Before we continue, subscribe right now because stories like this deserve to be heard. Fewer than 4% of viewers are subscribed. And this story about love, sacrifice, and impossible choices needs to reach as many people as possible. If you believe senior citizens deserve dignity and support instead of impossible financial decisions, hit that subscribe button now. Margaret and Robert Sullivan met in 1964 at a church gathering in Brooklyn. She was a young school teacher. He worked for the Postal Service. They fell in love quickly and built a simple but meaningful life together. Married in 1965, they spent 58 years side by side. Margaret taught 2nd grade for decades, while Robert delivered mail throughout New York, no matter the weather. They lived carefully. No luxury purchases. No reckless spending. They saved every extra dollar they could. Over nearly 6 decades, they managed to build a retirement savings account worth $127,000. It wasn't wealth. It was security. It represented their entire lifetime of sacrifice and discipline. Life wasn't perfect. Their daughter Sarah died in a tragic car accident in 1998, leaving emotional scars that never truly healed. Their son Michael eventually moved across the country to California, and over time the relationship became distant. Yet Margaret and Robert still had each other. Living in their small rent-controlled apartment for only $847 a month, surrounded by memories and family photographs, they found peace in growing old together. David Morrison wasn't just their landlord. He was family. He had always treated the Sullivans with kindness and respect, never increasing the rent unfairly and helping whenever problems arose. The bond between them stretched back decades. Then everything changed 18 months ago. Robert Sullivan was diagnosed with stage 4 pancreatic cancer. Doctors told the couple he likely had only 6 months left to live, maybe 9 if they were lucky. But there was an experimental treatment available that could possibly extend his life. The problem was that Medicare refused to cover it. Their insurance denied it immediately because the treatment wasn't approved for Robert's exact stage of cancer. The treatment cost $8.400 every month. Margaret looked at the man she had loved since she was 22 years old and made the only choice her heart would allow. She decided Robert's life mattered more than money, more than retirement, more than financial security, so every month she paid for the treatment. At first, the money came from their savings. Month after month, their account shrank, while Robert gained more precious time. Margaret never hesitated. She sat beside him through every painful treatment session, held his hand during sleepless nights, read him books, and played songs from their wedding day so he wouldn't feel alone. After 8 months, every penny of their $127,000 savings was gone. Completely gone. But Robert was still alive. Margaret refused to stop. She opened credit cards and maxed them out one after another. 5 cards, $31,000 in debt. Every dollar went toward keeping Robert alive just a little longer. Then came the moment that destroyed her completely. 3 months before Robert died, Margaret had exactly $847 left in her bank account. The rent was due. Robert's treatment was due. She could only pay one. She sat at the kitchen table where they had shared breakfast every morning for 43 years and made a choice no human being should ever have to make. She chose her husband. She paid for the treatment instead of the rent because 7 more days holding Robert's hand meant more to her than keeping the apartment. The next month she made the same choice again. And then again, every time David knocked on the door, asking what was wrong, Margaret stayed silent because she was ashamed. Ashamed that after an entire lifetime of hard work and careful saving, she could no longer afford either medicine or housing. 8 weeks before the courtroom hearing, Robert died in the same bedroom they had shared for nearly 6 decades. Margaret held his hand until his final breath. The treatment gave him 7 extra months of life. 7 months that cost Margaret everything. Back in the courtroom, Judge Judy listened carefully as Margaret finally explained everything through tears. The room became completely silent. Even the audience members, waiting for other cases, sat frozen, listening to the elderly widow describe how she sacrificed her entire future just to keep her husband alive a little longer. Margaret looked directly at Judge Judy and whispered, "Your Honor, I would do it all again, every penny, every sacrifice, because those 7 months meant everything to me." For the first time in 28 years, Judge Judy had no words. She slowly removed her glasses, and everyone noticed tears in her eyes. Then something happened that had never happened before on the show. Judge Judy stood up from the bench and walked directly toward Margaret in complete silence. The entire courtroom stared in shock. Judge Judy gently placed a hand on Margaret's shoulder and quietly said, "Mrs. Sullivan, what you described isn't an excuse. It's a tragedy. And it's a tragedy happening to thousands of elderly Americans every day." Then she turned to David Morrison. "If your best friend Robert were standing here today," she asked, "and told you he spent everything to save Margaret's life and couldn't pay rent, what would you have done?" David immediately broke down crying. "I would have forgiven every penny," he said. "Robert was my brother." Then he turned toward Margaret with tears streaming down his face. "Why didn't you tell me? I would help you." Margaret lowered her head. "I was ashamed." Judge Judy's voice suddenly became firm again. "Mrs. Sullivan, you did not fail. The system failed you. A country that forces an 80-year-old widow to choose between medical treatment and a roof over her head has failed." David walked over and tore up the lawsuit papers right there in court. He dropped the entire case instantly. But Judge Judy wasn't finished. Right there in the courtroom, she pulled out her phone and made a call. She contacted advocacy organizations and arranged immediate assistance for Margaret. Then she announced something that stunned everyone watching. "My show will pay off Mrs. Sullivan's entire $31 in medical debt." Gasps echoed through the courtroom. Before the audience erupted into applause, Judge Judy continued, "We will also pay 6 months of rent directly to Mr. Morrison, so Mrs. Sullivan has time to grieve properly without fear of eviction." Margaret burst into tears. David embraced her tightly, apologizing again and again for not realizing how much pain she had been carrying alone. 6 months later, Margaret was still living safely in her apartment, surrounded by the memories she and Robert built together. Her debt was gone. She began attending grief counseling and slowly reconnecting with her son. Inspired by everything that happened, David Morrison created a support fund in Robert Sullivan's memory to help elderly tenants facing medical emergencies. The courtroom footage spread across the internet, reaching millions of viewers worldwide. Thousands shared their own stories about medical debt and impossible financial decisions. Advocacy groups reported huge increases in seniors asking for help after hearing Margaret's story. Today, Margaret volunteers at a local hospice center, sitting beside dying patients and reminding them they are not alone. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone you love. Comment below if you believe no elderly person should ever have to choose between medical care and housing. And subscribe for more powerful courtroom stories that reveal both the cruelty and compassion that still exist in this world. Margaret Sullivan chose love over money. David Morrison chose forgiveness over anger. And Judge Judy chose compassion over protocol. Together, they reminded the world that humanity still matters, even in the darkest moments.